The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and welcome to another 1615 webinar. I'm Matthew Ellison. I serve as the president at 1615, and I also serve as a church missions coach with 1615. I want to thank you for tuning in today. We trust that today's webinar will be a blessing to you and your churches or agencies' work in missions. Now, before we get into the topic at hand, I want to let you know about a few upcoming events and resources. About 3 years ago, we developed a concept called the Mission Table. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's an online conversation about missions. One of the convictions behind the table is that many churches don't do missions well because they've not thought about missions well. So at this table, we want to provoke conversations about God's missionary cause. We bring together some of the most experienced missions thinkers and practitioners that we know, and we challenge some of the most critical, controversial topics that are impacting missions today. So please tune in at missiontable.org. We're in season 3 right now. A few more episodes will roll out this year, and then 4 more episodes will roll out in 2019. Actually, Dave Wilson is a guest on a couple of our upcoming episodes. Who's our presenter today? And then we'll let you know about a book that was released in January of 2018. It's entitled When Everything is Missions. It was co-authored by my good friend Denny Spitters. I'm the other author, of course. And we challenge this idea that everything is missions and every good or altruistic work done in Jesus' name is a missions work. Are these biblical concepts? Are they helpful concepts? Do they lead to more missions work being accomplished or less? So if you're wrestling with this idea of what missions actually is, you'll want to pick up this book. You can buy it at wheneverythingismissions.com. So today's webinar is entitled The Missionary Pipeline. This webinar will develop a practical application of the Great Commission mandate by describing a proactive and intentional process of raising up the next generations of sent ones within the context of the local church. Churches, both large and small, are not alone in this process. There are partners who are ready, willing, and available to help the church fulfill its mandate. Mission agencies, coaches, missionary training centers, and others are eager to connect with churches who are interested in getting organized. Today's subject matter experts are David Wilson and his wife, Lorene. They are editors of the book, Missionary Pipeline, and Dave serves as the Director of Church Relations at Avant. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to hand the microphone and controls over to David, but first, a few details. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality, which means you can listen in through computer speakers or you can call in on the telephone. As questions come to mind today, and we certainly hope they do, please type them in the question and answer panel, which is located in the GoToWebinar task panel on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We're going to be addressing your questions about the last 15 or 20 minutes of our time together. And again, this is your opportunity to enter into the conversation with Dave and Lorene. 80 people are registered for today's live webinar, and I want to remind all of you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing at 1615.org within about 3 days. I'm going to be turning it over to David here in just 1 second. It's going to take me a second to do that. And David and Lorene, thank you so much for taking time today to share with us about your new book and this very important topic of how churches can mobilize their people to the field. So Dave and Lorene, it's all yours.
Hey, Matthew, thanks for this opportunity. We really appreciate being able to meet some folks and talk about missionary mobilization in the church.
Yeah, this is a great connection point for us. And we're so thankful to be able to work together as a couple, but also people like you, Matthew, and for the opportunity to meet new friends on the webinar. So thanks.
Great. We're grateful for you guys too.
All right, looks like we have all the abilities to control the webinar. And we're going to just start off with big picture and then dive really quickly into some practical strategies. But just to start off, the Missionary Pipeline wanted to tell a little bit about our book, people that contributed to it, and then some of the themes on it. We don't want to talk about what's already written in the book. We want to highlight some things, but we also want to share why we wrote some of those things, some of our experiences, possibly some stories in there, just to be able to highlight and help bring out more of the theme of developing a missionary pipeline in your church. And we're making assumptions along the way. Some of the assumptions we're making is our audience is filled with people who actually go to church, who are possibly leaders in the church, and who are working to fulfill the Great Commission through the church. And some of the things that we talked about early on was the church is sometimes largely absent from Great Commission conversations. When we go to mission conferences, we see a lot of mission agency people, we see a lot of seminary people, we see a lot of folks who are doing missions on the field, but church leadership is largely missing from some of those conversations. So we thought, well, maybe they're just not equipped, maybe they just don't feel that they're invited into that. Maybe there's something that they're missing. And I was a missions pastor for more than 20 years in the church, and I loved going to those kind of conversations and those conferences just to be a part of that whole Great Commission feeling and vibe at some of these events. And I would love to share that with other church leaders and people just to bring them out and get into that conversation, but also to engage people in mission thinking for the next generation, because the next generation needs to have some intentional and proactive ministry right now. Those children that are in elementary school, high school, college, they need to have people who are investing in their lives right now. So part of the folks that part of the process of writing this book was inviting church leaders to author some of the content. We invited seminary leaders. We invited mission agency people. There's 40 different authors who contributed to the writing of the Missionary Pipeline book.
So next we're going to talk about just really quickly the general term pipeline, where that came from. So as we know, a pipeline transports commodities and resources where they're most needed. And it's also a business term. In my last job, we were in sales, and it was kind of a buzzword around the office, and I kept hearing this word, and they were talking about who's in the pipeline, where are they in the pipeline. But I remember it was always a clearly defined process to take customers through, and we felt that was really kind of significant. And it basically kept people on track and focused on what they were doing and what they were working towards. And so we can learn from these business lingo words and concepts and apply them in the church. And we thought this was, a great term, but then when we saw the quote from actually Steve Sweatman, who was also an author, one of our authors with MTI, and it was basically solidified. So here it is. We need a fully integrated global supply chain, a pipeline where disciples are the precious commodity, as well as an effective infrastructure to distribute and replicate them around the globe. And we thought that was pretty awesome quote.
So this pipeline concept, that's going to keep us focused. We want to focus on the concept of pipeline because there's so many different parts and pieces to getting missionaries out. And just to kind of give an idea of who some of these partners are, who some of these participants in the missionary pipeline, just to begin, the Great Commission. Jesus gave us the Great Commission, and he was speaking to people who were going to be making up the church. So the church is the first part of the pipeline. It's got to be where the source of our missionaries are coming from. And then the missionary themselves, they're being discipled, they're being mentored and cultivated into a lifestyle of going cross-culturally and serving the Lord in a variety of different ways. There's Bible schools. People have to be trained and to understand concepts like church planting and hermeneutics and all those kind of things more effectively. There's training organizations that bring in different concepts for cultural adaptation and language acquisition. There's coaches, consultants, and advocates, people who make their life mission to make sure that missionaries are well prepared and that the churches are well prepared to care for them as they're on the field. And then there's the sending agency. And you say, I left the sending agency for last. I've served in the church for 20 more years, and I've only been in a mission sending agency for 2 years now. But I realize that by the time a missionary candidate gets to us, the sending agency, they've already gone through all these other parts of the pipeline, and it's already too late sometimes for them to go back. Sometimes they have to put their lives on pause for a long period of time. But if we have a very good system with a pipeline in place, then by the time they get to the agency, they're well prepared and ready to go on the field. And it just makes our ministry so much more effective.
And by the way, I wanted to make sure that I say, or that we say, all of these elements and people and processes are integral parts of the pipeline.
And the pipeline represents discipleship. We'll talk a little bit about how Jesus discipled his disciples. But for right now, I want to take a step back and think of what are the distractions? What are the things that's causing us to not have a very good pipeline in place right now? You know, distractions are important. We talk about it sometimes with driving. When you're in a car and you're behind the wheel and you're in drive, you need to drive the car. You don't need to be texting. You don't need to be drinking and eating. There's dangerous consequences to being distracted when you're driving. We also have enemies. Sometimes people, like this pickpocket, this scene here, this person is distracted, but the pickpocket is taking advantage of that distraction. We actually have an enemy, a spiritual enemy, that loves to distract us from what we're supposed to be doing, the Great Commission. And magic, you know, it's all about distraction, sleight of hand, all those kind of things. The way you get people's attention away from what they're supposed to be looking at is their distractions. Think about it in your church, in your setting right now. What are some of the distractions? Sometimes it's church splits. That's one of the most devastating ones. When churches go through times of transition and hardships, those are very difficult times. And you get lost and get off track from going to do the Great Commission. The tyranny of urgent takes place sometimes. We also have moments in the church where we're doing good things. We're doing some really, really good things in the world, but possibly not doing the Great Commission. We get lost in doing the good things. It makes us feel good. It puts a little bit of ring in our bell, but it's not fulfilling the Great Commission. And we also sometimes just get in a rut. We get bored. We have things that are going on in our lives, in the ministries, in the church, that just seem like it's routine and mundane. But missions is exciting. Going to other cultures. I mean, there's a sense that a little bit of help and energy and effort will bring out more excitement in the church rather than putting us to sleep. Jesus gave us some final instructions. Of course, we realize that the Great Commission is an important thing, or else we wouldn't be in this audience right now. But the Great Commission, there's something more to it. Understanding the Great Commission, these were the final instructions from a significant leader who had just died and was resurrected from the grave, and he was about to ascend into heaven, and he was turning the keys to his work over to a bunch of people here on this earth. That's the situation where the Great Commission was given. He gave it 5 different times. If you look through Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts, Jesus gave these Great Commission instructions at 5 different times, 5 different places, and these groups of people were really invested in doing what he was saying. We should be taking that final instruction from Jesus as well. He talked about go to where? All the world. He talked about, here's what you do. You teach them to be disciples, to go into all the world and to make disciples and to proclaim the good news and to baptize. That you are the one responsible. And it's not just to teach them to obey, but it's not just to teach them the Great Commission, but to teach them to obey, that you are responsible for that. and that you will have power. You are witnesses. You will receive power. He said, I am sending you. I'm going to be with you. I'm sending the promise of the Father with you to teach them to make disciples among all nations.
So a quick word on the mission stats, which most of us have heard, but just as a reminder, and wondering if you knew that there's 400 evangelical churches for every one unreached people group. And the Joshua Project provides a clearly identified list of every group, who they are, where they're located in the world. And honestly, when I look at it, it seems like a really overwhelming task to try to get the gospel to all these groups. However, we want to mention the difference it will make if we work together. And that's, we really have to be proactive and intentional. You'll hear those words and us say that several times during this webinar, and that's what we're really passionate about, is having all these groups kind of come together and work together. So, and this, I love this quote by Missio Nexus: the Great Commission is too big for anyone to accomplish alone, and too important not to try to do it together. So we'll talk about some of these practical steps your church can take in just a few minutes.
So to get very specific with the church, here's some of the things that we've seen that has been helpful in churches, the churches that we've served in, but also the churches where we consult with now and work with, is that you have a baseline foundational understanding of what the Great Commission is and what you are as a church and how you're a part of that Great Commission. We love to start with this upstream collective definition. We got to meet with Brad Bell and Larry McCrary and a bunch of those guys from Upstream Collective recently, and just been able to spend time with them reading their books and getting to understand this. But this is a really great foundational statement here. Sending Church is a local community of Christ followers who have made a covenant together to be prayerful, deliberate, proactive in developing, commissioning, and sending their own members both locally and globally, often in partnership with other churches or agencies, and continuing to encourage, support, and advocate for them while they make disciples cross-culturally. Now, just imagine, you've got a group of people at your church, you really want to make a missionary pipeline important in your church. You get those people together, you get them in a room, and you say, okay, let's just start with this as a statement. And you say, our church, First Baptist Church, First Methodist Church, whatever the church is, our church is a local community of Christ followers who have made a covenant together. So you start with this and you kind of tweak it, make it your own. Take this and say, okay, we'll remove this part, we'll add this part, we'll make this more highlighted. So if you start with a statement and then you all agree on that, and then you can start working towards practical steps to implement that. That's one of the key things that you really need to do. You've got to have that vision statement, mission statement right there in front of everybody. Everybody agrees on it, and then they move forward from there.
Of course, before we jump into these practical steps, and there's quite a few really essential ones, we want to mention prayer is the foundational element. We wrote the pipeline book, that we couldn't even make that a chapter. It had to be like foundation chapter. At the very beginning, that's where we focus is prayer. And we all know how essential it is. So there's a lot of practical ways that you could use prayer in your congregation to make sure everybody's praying for workers in the harvest. And these would be for people that are already working on the mission field, but also to raise up that next generation. For example, you could focus on Luke 10:2 and set your phone or watch alarms to go off at 10:02 every day as a reminder to pray. That's just one example. There's many things you can do, but Dave's going to talk about the rest of the practical stuff.
So you've got this foundational statement, and you want to have practical steps to unleash your church's full potential. First thing, Matthew Ellison talks about this. Every time I hear Matthew speak at different conferences and different workshops and all, I always hear him talk about the pastor of the church. And I sometimes think, okay, that's an important thing, but is it the most important? And he's already convinced me, yes, it is the most important. It's the number one thing. The practical step that you've got to have is pastor engagement. Now, Different churches, different size churches, they have different types of ways of doing things. Some larger, extraordinarily large churches, mega churches, the pastor may not know the name of every single missionary, but if he's fully engaged in doing the thing that he can do in missions, preaching on missions, making sure there's a missions budget, making sure that there are events around the church calendar, all those kind of things are important for pastors to do. Preaching on theology of suffering, those kind of things are essential. Smaller churches, yeah, the pastor probably needs to know the names of the missionaries. He probably needs to go on a mission trip every once in a while. He probably needs to have a little bit more investment, more hands-on type things. But different churches have to have their pastors properly engaged in making sure not just that he is missions invested or missions involved, but that he's Great Commission involved. We want to make sure that the pastor has the total vision of what Jesus was wanting to accomplish through his church. It wasn't to be a social club, wasn't to be just a hospital even, but it was supposed to be a place that equipped and deployed the people into all the world to share the good news of Jesus Christ. So pastor engagement is number one. All these other things fall underneath that. Looking for successful churches to model. Now, let's say you're a medium-sized church, maybe 1,000 members on a Sunday morning. You're a fairly good-sized church. You're able to do some pretty key things with missions. Look to other churches, maybe churches that have done things that you would like to accomplish, and then go in and look for their models. Interview, find out what's going on. I would even say if you have a missions committee at your church, break off a few folks from that missions committee or that missions team and have them, their sole purpose, their total reason for existing in that missions committee is to mobilize missionaries, the next generation of missionaries, and that they work on a model that would fit your church. And if it's elders, if it's something whatever kind of leadership model that you have, find churches that do that, and then learn from them. A couple of people that I look to is Todd Rasmussen. He's at Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis, and also Steve Byrne from Calvary Church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Those two guys have not only done the work, but they've actually written about it. And it's really cool because they shared their experience with us, and they were able to give us their the content for their nurture program, for their cross-training program, and it's on our website. So if you go to missionarypipeline.org, that would be our website. They've actually given us permission to share that with all of you folks. So go to missionarypipeline.org, and you'll be able to see what they've done, download it, and use it for your own church context. And we just really appreciate people that openly share resources like that. Another thing, develop a strategic partnership with an agency. Now, I work with a mission agency. Avant Ministries is the agency that I can tell you more about. I've been able to talk to other organizations from a variety of different missionary sending groups. But one of the things, we're having a little bit of problem here with our, excuse me, folks, for a minute. We just got to get our PowerPoint to the right place. There we go. All right, develop a strategic partnership with an agency. Avant Ministries has been around since 1892, and we really have a good way of doing ministry. We do church planting around the world and unreached places of the world. And one of the things that we do, we send a lot of missionaries through churches, and churches will support those missionaries. But one of the key things that we have is called joint venture. Joint venture is where a church says, we want to invest deeply in this one place in the world, and they send multiple families. They send families and singles and couples to live, to learn the language, and to plant the church where there is no church right now. And that requires a great degree of cooperation between the church and the mission agency. And that's just like the pinnacle. That's like the greatest thing to be able to have a church really deeply invest in a place in the world that's really needing the gospel, and an agency comes along and says, hey, we'll take care of all the finances, we'll do all the training, we'll do all the cross-cultural stuff, and you as a church, you invest in your people, you disciple, you plant the church, and it just really works out well. So there's lots of different levels of partnership, but churches and agencies are beginning to work together really well. And if you need more help, there are lots of consultants, coaches, experts who are out there who are willing to consult with you. Matthew Ellison and 1615, they've done a wonderful job. I'm a personal testimony to be able to share with you that I know of churches that have used his work and have done great things sending missionaries out through their church. So find that consultant, that expert, that coach that will go into your church and bring out the Great Commission potential from within your congregation. Next, you want to establish priorities. You want to look at, okay, do we want to send X number of people to the field? Do we want to send people to do this type of ministry? All these different priorities is what your church, it has to be custom made and crafted from within your body. And then that is all coming from a Great Commission and what we like to call a pipeline team. So if you create this Great Commission pipeline team within your church of people, they probably should have a little bit of experience being on the mission field. They might be people who are parents of missionaries who are on the field, maybe pastors, retired pastors are really good to be a part of the team. So develop that Great Commission pipeline team, give them the tools like a budget and a calendar, and to be able to sit somewhere and really frame what your sending potential is, and then start working on it.
So here's the website, just some websites of what Dave already mentioned. For joint venture at avantministries.org churches, and then Matthew's website, of course, is the 1615.org.
Great. So as we're talking about this team concept, you want to develop this team, this Great Commission pipeline team. It's not going to be another committee. They're not going to have their hands tied with a lot of different policies and all these kind of things. But you want to go from making decisions as a committee to actually making disciples. Here's what I mean by that. Making decisions would be like somebody comes to your church and says, hey, I want to be a missionary and I want you to support me. And you sit around, you debate it, and you say, okay, yeah, we'll support him, or, well, no, we're not. That's not what I'm talking about. Being a Great Commission sending pipeline church is that you're going to start not looking at people who are already out there fundraising, but you're going to look at your young people. You're going to look at your elementary school age, high school, middle school, those ages right there. What do you have to do to make them more aware of the Great Commission and their role that you want them to play in it, and how your church is going to work? You're going to move from supporting missionaries to actually sending missionaries. You're going to invest in your people to make your people understand and hear the voice of God so that they can be sent out from among you. You go from having these large events, these large mission conferences, to smaller gatherings with workers. You know, we hear all the time, we ask missionaries, okay, when was it that you first heard God call you to be a missionary? When was it that you first felt like you were called out to do mission work? And it almost always has to do with, I met a missionary one time. They came to my church. They came to my parents' home, and we had dinner with them. We had this dessert. There's always a small gathering with missionaries, and that person had a personal relationship with that missionary that was very small and intimate. And you want to go from these large short-term mission trips, which is designed just for exposure, just to help people get a better understanding of what the rest of the world is. If the purpose of your short-term mission trip is just to send out a bunch of people so that they become more internationally aware, anybody can do that. It doesn't have to be a church trip. It can be a school. It can be anybody else. It doesn't have to be a mission trip. But you want to be more intentional. Send smaller groups of people. so that they're exploring the idea of possibly being a missionary at some point in the future. Not so that they're exposed to the world, but that they're exploring God's call for them in their lives and their mission calling.
So it's important to talk about these rites of passage, and that was a chapter in our pipeline book. And we also wrote an article in the EMQ magazine, which is the Evangelical Missions Quarterly, if you're not familiar with it. This was in the July-September edition. This is it's published by Missio Nexus, and if you don't already subscribe to them, I would strongly encourage that. This particular edition was specifically focused on mobilization, like the whole magazine, all the articles. So it's excellent for you to go back and read. But here's a little really quick summary. And it was provided by Jesus, his own example of leadership in the Gospel of Luke, where he mentored his disciples by using a progressive steps of development. So really quickly, the first step is following and trusting him. And we're just walking alongside the teacher. And then the next step would be where he's teaching them to obey him. Not only is that gaining knowledge, but also engaging people in meaningful service in the church and the community. And that's, for an example, when he shared parables and people saw him observing miracles. Then the next one was step up, and that's about organizing and getting ready for the blessing that he's about to provide. So that includes catching the vision, seeing the task ahead, and actually implementing the strategy. An example, one of the examples there is the feeding of the 5,000, and where Jesus, his disciples saw him perform that miracle. And then also step out, and that's basically the training spiritually, relationally, and cross-culturally to be sent out into the world to spread the gospel. And this, Jesus prepared his disciples for that very purpose. And he prepared them for hardship, for suffering, rejection, but also success. So he sent them out prepared. And you talked about rites of passage a little bit of what that means.
Yeah, I felt when I was growing up that I missed out on some things in church life. I missed out on a variety of different events because my Jewish friends, they had the bar mitzvah. Boy, that was a powerful thing in the lives of the Jewish young man who was growing up. And they actually would say, you are now a man. There was a rite of passage. That was a point in time where that young person took a step and moved over into something significant in his life. And as an evangelical, I didn't get things like that. I just kind of moved through. It's kind of the mushy part of evangelicalism. We don't have rites of passage. Catholics have rites of passage. They have their catechism and all those kind of things. So they get to celebrate these specific rites that's going along. And even Mormons, if you may not agree with their message, but you can't deny their methods. Their methods of that expectation of that 2-year mission. Once they graduate high school, before they go off to college or wherever in the world, they have this 2-year mission, and that's such a highlight for them in their faith walk, but also just in their lives, period. And I tell you, I meet 40 and 50-year-old Mormons, and they always talk about, oh yeah, my 2-year mission was in Ecuador or wherever. They still hold on to those times when they actually went through that rite of passage. And I think that we need to get back to stuff like that. That's something that our mushy culture, evangelicals, but also Western culture, we don't embrace those kind of things, and I think our people are suffering for it. So if you can establish rites of passage in your church, I think it would be beneficial for you.
So the several we're going to just mention quickly. It's education, events, exposure, expectations, experiences, and excursions. Yes, all starting with the letter E for you to remember. So an education that goes beyond the Sunday morning sermon and just going to church on Sunday. It's studies that are specifically focused on God's heart for the nations. And there's actually a lot of these. one to highlight, if you haven't heard of Perspectives, most of us have, which is pretty intensive, but there's also a lot of different options that churches can do, like 6-week study, and we actually have posted quite a few of those on our website, so our examples are out there, and there are many more to be added. And then events that are focused specifically on missions. For example, Urbana, Missio Nexus has an awesome conference, and this could also be local missions conference. And we'll be attending the ICOM conference in Cincinnati, Ohio next week, which is a really excellent event to take your mission leaders to. And we'd be glad to know if you're going to be at ICOM, let us know, and we'd love to meet and connect with you there. And as a matter of fact, that conference is located in different areas every year. And next November, Avant Ministries will have a large exhibit because it's going to be in Kansas City. So we're pretty excited about that. Then exposure. Dave kind of already mentioned this a little bit, but as he said, most of the missionaries we talked to said they had some encounter with a missionary at some point in their lives that made a huge impact on their decision to go. I mean, 9 times out of 10, we talk to somebody and that's what they say. So I would strongly encourage you to invite missionaries to come speak, at least on an annual basis, but more frequently if possible. And then those expectations, you want to establish clear expectations and requirements that people can use as markers in their spiritual walk or steps along the way that they can point to and as a point of growth in their involvement in missions. For an example, you could go on a short-term trip, which are great for that as a starting point. If you wanted to do that, you would have to be serving in some capacity in a ministry at your church for so long. So you just need to establish that ahead of time. Like, if you want to do this, here's the markers, the steps you need to take. And then experiences would include going outside of the church and serving in the community or reaching out to internationals that live nearby. And there's a lot of those groups now that you can connect with. And so that's basically as a step to go cross-cultural to get out of your comfort zone. And then excursions, you could visit a mission sending organization. We would love for you, if you're in the Kansas City area, we'd love for you to come by Avant and talk to our staff and some of our missionaries. You're more than welcome to come as a trip from your church. And then, of course, short-term trips, then you're going to start there as maybe a 2-week trip and then challenge them to go for a longer period of time. You could go, young people could go over a summer or families could go. So there's a lot of options there. And if you have any questions, we didn't mention before, but if you have any questions or comments, we're getting close to our time of Q&A. Go ahead and submit your question or comment to Matthew.
Yeah, so in that dialog box, you can put your questions there, even comments. We'd like to make this very interactive if we can. We're going to give you our contact information even after this is over with, but we want to be a resource for you. So just as kind of wrapping some of this up, I have some of content here for pastors, developing a theology of suffering and those kind of things. But let me just kind of wrap up what we're talking about here. If you're going to make a missionary pipeline in your church a priority, you need to have a group of people that's going to gather around the table and talk about building a foundation, making that mission statement, talking through what are your priorities. You're going to have to get that team together on a regular basis, agree on some things, and then you put into place these rites of passage where you talk about your next generation, how to make, you're not going to create a new ministry, but you're going to create this missions, Great Commission culture within your ministry that already exists. You don't have to create another children's ministry just for missions, but have people that go and speak to your young people on a regular basis. Have things around the calendar. Build in like a monthly moment for praying for missionary kids that you guys support. Have something that's already in existence in your church, but invest the nations into what's already in existence. You don't have to create a new thing. You just need to invest deeply the nations into what already exists. This rites of passage is just a thing to think about, how it fits within your culture. You know, if you're a Vineyard church, or if you're a Baptist church, or if you're an Assemblies of God church, you're going to do different things in different ways. So we didn't want to give you a model. We want to share with you principles, help you understand how you can put these kind of things in what already currently exists, and then bring them out. And if you need more help with this, if you need us to come up to your church and do whiteboarding sessions or spend some time with your leaders, that's what we do. I'm director of church relations. We travel all over the country, and we're always going to different churches, and we would love to be a part of your church. All right, Matthew, I think we're ready to go into a Q&A session, and we'll end up with a little bit of time at the end to help pastors develop that theology of suffering. But for right now, let's go to a Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Dave, Lorraine. Let me get this question and answer panel opened here. And we'll turn it over to our live audience here. So let's see. This is from Kenneth. I think this goes beyond the topics that you covered, but it certainly is an interesting question here. Should we continue supporting retired missionaries, Dave and Lorraine?
I love churches that support retired missionaries. There's a church that we just visited back, was it January? Mm-hmm. And just outside of Seattle, Washington, Vancouver, Washington, I think it was. And that church has been supporting this one couple of missionaries through Avant for 50 years. We were there to celebrate their 50-year anniversary of supporting that same missionary. This couple is retired, but they're still doing wonderful ministry, even in retirement, working in their church, helping the next generation get deployed. And so even when missionaries retire, they still have purpose and meaning, and they can be investing in the next generation. So 50 years of supporting the same people from that same church, that was just a wonderful thing to celebrate with them.
This question comes from David Jacob, and it's somewhat related to the previous question. Since career missionaries are some of the best mobilizers of others, how can a church best utilize missionary guests and speakers? Any suggestions?
Yeah, those smaller events, having speakers, missionaries to come in from outside. You know, if your church doesn't currently support missionaries, but you're wanting to start this missionary pipeline, one of the great things you can do is contact us at Avant or any other mission agencies. We probably have some workers that are in that area, and that we can send, and that's generally the best way to get a missions heart, is when you actually hear from a missions heart.
Yeah, I love Acts 14:27, when Paul and Barnabas returned from their first missionary journey. And it says that they gathered the church and they rehearsed the work of the Spirit and how the door of faith had been opened unto the Gentiles. And you just nailed it. They were sharing stories of faith, God stories of how he was using that church in Antioch, through this missionary band that had been sent out to bring faith to the Gentiles. I want to insert something there, David. I totally agree. I think the small group gatherings, floating around to the church, to the different ministries, children's ministry, high school, maybe home groups, those are great venues where really a missionary can just open up and share the stories. I also think there's a place for Sunday morning, when the church is all together gathered at one time to share those stories. One of the drawbacks, I was a missions pastor at a large church, and there was always a bit of hesitancy giving the microphone to a missionary, because they're so excited to share but in a context like that, just again, this is maybe just an interesting idea, maybe a helpful concept. I would encourage the missionary to think about 2 to 3 minutes and to literally summarize one meaningful event from the field, where maybe they, minister to a specific person, their name, what happened. I think there's a place for that broadcast as well, but the missionary needs to be prepared, lest they, again, I get it. They're excited. They haven't spoken to a church, maybe for a while, but you don't want them to take up 25 minutes when they were supposed to only have 5. So anyway, just an idea there.
Yeah, and one more thing with that, Matthew.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
I love talking to Neil Parolo. He wrote the book Serving Ascenders and several other books. And whenever I'm with him, he talks about Acts 14, that reentry debriefing segment that he talks about. And one of the things that always rings in my ear about when missionaries come to share at the church, he always says that very last verse in Acts 14. It says, "And they remained there no little time with the disciples."
Yeah, that's good.
And it's I think there's got to be times that when you're up on stage and you give them, the 3-minute spot on Sunday morning, but then use that 3-minute spot to invite them back for a much longer debrief of, a more substantial amount of time to actually hear their stories of not just the glowing successes and all that you want to hear, but also maybe some of their hardship and their suffering stories.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Steve Weems from OMF just says he's going to be there. I'm assuming Icon. Is that right? Anyway, he wants to talk to you guys. I just want to plant that seed there. Steve Weems from OMF is going to be there. I'm assuming it's that event, and he's going to talk to you folks.
Yeah.
So this is from, okay, great. So this is from Corey. I get what you're saying about rites of passage, but don't you think Jesus would rather us be in the relationship and trust his will and timing for each person? How do you do the rites of passage without being ritualistic?
Yeah, and that is a hard line. The rites of passage, I think anything that we do that matters requires planning. It requires a degree of insight into our culture. And if you just think of anything within our culture, that there's steps along the way for every single thing. I mean, I remember getting a mortgage for our home. There's steps along the way. You got to get a pre-approval letter, and then you got to do that. I mean, there's method. Even in our messy world, there's still method in anything that's important. If buying a home is an important thing, and there's steps that you have to take to that, that's what I'm saying with rites of passage. It's steps. You don't have to call it rites of passage, but boy, it sure does. If you leave anticipation in there, if you leave, hey, if you read this book and if you serve with the children's ministry, then we're going to ask you to go on this short-term trip. There's steps along the way. It doesn't have to be ritualistic, but it does need to be intentional, and it needs to be very well thought out and proactive.
Very good. So Morgan asks, how do mission agencies start to build a relationship with local churches? Great question.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to know the answer to that myself. So I tell you, we've been here for 2 years, and Lorraine and I, we travel together. We're probably in 50 different beds every year, traveling to visit different churches up in all the way from Seattle to Southern California. We were in Philadelphia this year. Whenever we go, we try to line up visits with those churches everywhere we go. And so in a lot of ways, on our side, the agency side, I'm really trying to make the extra effort to just get in, shake hands. I don't just try to visit the pastor, but I try to find out, okay, who's the missions person? Who's that Aunt Sally person that's really the driver of missions in the church? And I try to get in there. But there's another side of it where the church needs to contact the agency and say, hey, who do I talk to in the rare event that something happens with our missionary? Who is it that I need to talk to? We wrote another book back in 2015 called Mind the Gaps. It's on engaging the church in missionary care. And we really took a stance at that point, because I was in a church at the time, that the church needs to be proactive and intentional about developing relationships with the agencies. That church, I think I had maybe 23 different missionaries from 15 different agencies. And I got on the phone with all those agencies. Who's the director of church relations? Who's the member care person? Who's the director of development? So I wanted to make sure that I had a hot list, and I had a list for every one of our missionaries and all the agencies. So I think it takes intentionality on both sides, the church and the agency, to develop that key relationship.
Yeah, that's good. I like this question from Mike. What's the trend in missionary recruitment? Are we seeing missionaries sent from churches? What about ethnic churches?
Yeah, so, okay, that's two questions there. The trends in recruitment is what we're trying to upset. The trend right now is that our recruiters, our mobilizers, they focus on the Bible schools, Biola and Moody Bible Institute and Liberty. Those are schools that we, there's lots of different schools, but our recruiters spend a lot of time at at the Bible schools doing recruiting at different events that they are a part of. The thing that we need to keep that, because that's where the audience, that's where the people are. They're there to go on to be ministry oriented later on, and we're trying to help them save the nations. We are trying to work more intentionally with churches and have churches develop this pipeline so that the church would actually come to us. If we develop a good relationship as Avant with the church that already sends missionaries, then it's just natural. They say, hey, we've got 3 candidates. They're in our training program right now. We'd like for you to come and spend some time with them. I would love to get that phone call. That would be the most awesome phone call in the world, that a church is actually calling me saying, hey, we've got some people that want to interview you as an agency. And the other part of it is not just recruiting. I think there's a difference between what recruitment is and what mobilization is. Mobilization, we have a team of people who are mobilizers at Avant, and they spend time with young people. They go, they live with them, they work with them, they go overseas with them. There's a whole movement where they're discipling, mentoring, and they're spending time with them. Learning how to speak Arabic together is a wonderful activity that some of our mobilizers are doing. They're just learning how to speak Arabic, and that's mobilizing and discipling and ministry for the next generation.
And the second part of the question was about
Ethnic churches.
Ethnic churches. Yeah, if we could figure that out. The ethnic churches in the United States have such a wonderful opportunity. They have some things that we as I'm a white guy, Marine's white. We have some things that cause problems with trying to get into other parts of the world. I have a blue passport. That blue passport would not get into Saudi Arabia, to Yemen, to different places like that. But if you have a Brazilian passport, if you have a Mexican passport, those are passports that actually are beneficial for the mission enterprise. Now, ethnic churches, African American church, the Latino church, we just had workshops in Missio Nexus in Orlando last month, specifically addressing those kinds of things. How do you mobilize the ethnic churches within the United States? Because there's obvious limitations. There's fundraising limitations. There's lots of different things that are getting in the way. But I think one of the keys that I've been able to pick up on is tent making, business as mission, being able to be a kingdom business oriented person, and that kind of person can get into anywhere in the world in a far more efficient way than I can.
Yeah, that's good. I want to ask one more question here as we prepare to wrap this up. I think it's related to the last question. This is from Daniel. What conditions in the church produce disciple-making disciples?
What conditions in the church? Say that one more time.
What conditions in the church produce disciples who make disciples? So what type of culture, I guess I would maybe tweak that a little bit. Hopefully I'm not putting words in Daniel's mouth. But so what's happening in a church that is actually making disciples who make disciples? What's the culture of that church?
So the churches that I've been a part of that have been disciple-making churches, it comes from the top. It's not just taught from the stage. It's not just we need to go out and make disciples. It's not just an imperative, but it's modeled. It's when the leaders of the church actually go out and do it themselves in their own lives. It's when the leaders invite younger people, those who are wanting to learn more about it, they invite them to go and live life with them and to do it with them. If it's church planting, there's churches that just do church planting naturally, but it's because it's part of the DNA. It's because it's part of the experience and the lifestyle that's modeled from the leaders. And it's got to come from the top. There's very few things in the church that are grassroots. There's quite a few things that are done as part of the DNA, but in the church, very rarely, I'm not saying exclusive language here, but it's very rare that it's done from a grassroots perspective. Vast majority of the churches that are disciple-making disciples, right, and that are actually doing long-term church planting, reproducing, and all that comes from the top. It's got to be pastor engagement.
Yeah, I'm going to insert something into there. I really love the question, Daniel. Thank you for asking it. I think Dave nailed it. We see an incredible example of this in Acts chapter 13 with the church at Antioch. And we know this is the first church that really had global vision. The church in Jerusalem was reticent to, make sense of the cross-cultural dimensions of the Great Commission, but everything changed at Antioch. And it says that the prophets and the teachers were in a season of worship and fasting. And so Dave talked about the importance of leadership involvement. And you see that in Antioch. It was the leaders that God had appointed to the church that were seeking his face regarding, their global instructions, as it were. And then I would add to that, it says they were worshiping. I think that's very significant. This was a God-passionate church. To borrow from Dr. John Piper, he says, where zeal for worship is weak, zeal for missions will also be weak. So they're passionate about knowing God, and thus they're passionate about making him known. So just a couple insights there, I think, that come out of Acts 13, and you nailed it, David, that it's activated leadership. If the leaders of the church are not embracing a global vision, it's pretty tough to mobilize a church to make disciples who are going to go to the ends of the earth. And I think directly connected to that is that they were worshiping him themselves there in Antioch. As they were awaiting their global instructions, they themselves were giving him praise. And I think that is absolutely critical. So just a little insert from me there. Daniel, again, thank you for a great question. I want to be mindful of the fact that this webinar is supposed to conclude here any minute now. I did tell Dave and Lorene, if we had a good number of attendees online, that I would be happy to continue the conversation, and we have some folks out there. So we're formally going to conclude this webinar today. I want to thank everyone for participating. I want to remind everyone that this webinar will be available for viewing in just a couple of days. Again, I'm Matthew Ellison with 1615. Thank you for being here. This will conclude the formal presentation, but those who want to remain online, Dave and Lorene will be around for about 10 or 15 more minutes. Thanks again for participating today.